And now it is our great pleasure to introduce the Fred of Around the World with Fred, Fred Rosenbaum.
Okay, thank you, Reva, very much for that, for arranging this. Thank you, Claire and Millie, for your help on the tech side. Really means a lot. Now, Upheaval is a highly informative and compelling documentary, but an idealized life story, in my opinion. The large majority of the commentators extol Menachem Begin, many of them his close friends, former comrades in arms, veterans of his administration, and the only historical consultant that's listed in the credits is the CEO of the Begin Heritage Center. Now, he was a great leader, but I'd like to provide a more balanced and accurate picture of that exceptional leadership. In short, I think his biography is more complex than that shown in the film. Now, except for the founding of the country, only with that exception, his 6.5-year tenure was the most consequential in Israel's history. I will focus on Begin's tumultuous life before he came to power in 1977, a long, rebellious period that reveals a great deal because both his principles and his personality were almost unchanged from adolescence to old age. And on Thursday night, you'll hear from Avi Shalom, I think the best biographer of Begin, and he will cover the period of Begin in power, 1977 on. Let's look at the first slide. I admire Menachem Begin. Yes, I disagreed with some of his policies, sometimes vociferously. Yet, like Jews around the world, like all people of goodwill, I thought his peace treaty with Egypt at Camp David was extraordinary, a masterful and courageous act of statesmanship. Moreover, he was incorruptible, without a whiff of personal scandal or extravagance. Hardly the case with some of his successors as prime minister. Now, Begin lived in the same modest one-bedroom apartment in Tel Aviv for almost 3 decades before moving into the prime minister's residence. His family life, as the film shows, was remarkably rock solid from the time he married Eliza in Poland on the eve of the Holocaust. The movie rightly stresses Begin's stature. I would add Ben Gurion and Rabin, all three with gravitas that has been lacking in recent Israeli and American political leaders, who have been driven more by opportunism than by core beliefs. I think it'll be a long time before we see the likes of these kind of leaders again. Most of all, I admire Begin's total and unshakable devotion to his people. For the sake of Zion, for the goal of creating a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael, he focused all of his prodigious talents, put his life on the line time and time again. And once it came into being, he endured 29 lonely years in the opposition, ridiculed and dismissed as a crank. What other politician anywhere loses 8 elections in a row before finally winning? His perseverance, and even more so his passion, were his greatest strengths. But as one historian has put it, he sometimes became the prisoner of that passion. The prisoner of his passion. One sees that in the disastrous Lebanon War of 1982. And I think that's covered very thoroughly in the film, the tragedy of that. And one sees it at key moments in the early period I will cover tonight, even as he played a vital role in bringing Israel into existence. Okay, you can remove that slide now. Thank you. Now, there have been many varieties of Zionism, and two rival visions emerged in the 20th century as the most powerful. The first, identified with David Ben-Gurion, labor Zionism, governed without a break for the first 29 years of statehood. The second, embodied by Menachem Begin, has ruled with a few notable exceptions ever since. In all but 8 of the last 45 years, his party, Likud, has been in power. Now, let me describe these two movements in some detail, and you'll be able to see the contrast between them. Can we have the next slide? This is a chart that I made that will show you the differences. Now, as I go into this, you see labor Zionism on the left, revisionist Zionism, as Begin's movement was called, on the right. Let me say at the outset, this is not the landscape today. This is what Begin faced in his life. But today, I think most of you know, labor Zionism has declined sharply, really over the last 20 years. So in Begin's time, let's say in the 1960s, labor Zionism could get over 50 seats out of 120 and easily lead a coalition with a few other parties. Today, labor Zionism has only 7 seats, today's Knesset. That's because the country has moved so far to the right. If we were to have a chart like this for 2022, you would have the competitors of revisionist Zionism, not labor so much, but actually centrists. That's really the makeup of Israeli politics now. It's the right wing versus those who are centrists or slightly, very slightly left of center. These are parties led by Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. Maybe those names are familiar to you. As you know, the Israelis go to the polls again in only 8 days. And we'll see if the Likud comes back to power. We'll see the kind of coalition. But it will be either the right-wing bloc or the centrist bloc. Now, let's take a look at these, again, at the 20th century. I put Theodor Herzl in the center because both movements feel that they are his rightful heir. You see, though, that he died very early. You know that Herzl was the one who convened the first Zionist Congress in 1897. Now, if we go down to the next line, you see the sort of the founders. For labor Zionism, it's the second Aliyah. And that's a group of about 35,000, that's all, very idealistic young people who, in many respects, planted the seeds of modern Zionism. They began the kibbutz movement, the defense organizations. They revived the Hebrew language in this second Aliyah. The revisionists stem from the philosophy of one man, Vladimir Jabotinsky, and I'm going to talk about him in greater detail a little bit later on. Now we see the two patriarchs, Ben Gurion and Begin. And you see that Ben Gurion is a generation older than Begin. And so he had to contend both with Jabotinsky and with Begin. And then I just added some of the other prime ministers who followed these two, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, and then on the other side, of course, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Now then look at some of the institutions. And the reason I want to have this introduction is because I'm going to be speaking about using some of these terms later on. HaShomer HaTzair was the youth group of labor Zionism. Haganah was their armed militia before statehood. And Mapai, the name of their political party. The counterpart on the revisionist side, the dynamic youth group, is called Beitar. And their militia, an underground militia, fighting against the British, the Irgun. And Begin first, after statehood, first started the Herut party, and then later, of course, Likud. Now, look for a second, then the next line, the goals of these two and how they differ. For labor Zionism, it was territorial compromise. They accepted the UN partition plan of 1947. They, of course, engineered the Oslo Accords, called Rabin in that, and they're essentially for a two-state solution. But this is not so for the revisionist side. They embrace territorial maximalism and Jewish domination of Greater Israel. Today, that would, of course, mean the West Bank. Then let's take a look at their economic agenda. Labor Zionism has been socialist or democratic socialist with strong labor unions, such as the Histadrut. But that's not so for revisionist Zionism. They are more for free market capitalism, and they have placed restrictions on unions. This is, in some ways, this is a right versus left chart, of course, but you see it's a little more complicated than that, and that would be oversimplifying it. Now we get to further with the economy. Labor Zionism is, of course, identified with the kibbutz movement and agriculture. Revisionist Zionism, urban small business. And now for Judaism and the Jewish state, labor Zionism has been secular. Revisionist Zionism has been secular also, by and large, but comfortable with the Orthodox and even with the ultra-Orthodox. That's a very big difference. And last of all, the constituency. Labor Zionism is associated with the Ashkenazim, Jews from Eastern Europe and Germany. But revisionist Zionism enjoys two other constituencies that have really given it a boost in the last decades. The Mizrahim, the Jews from the Mediterranean basin and North Africa and Middle East. And finally, Jews from the former Soviet Union. Because of those two that revisionist Zionism has surged. Okay, thank you. You can remove that now. Now, let's look at the next slide, please. Into more detail about Vladimir Jabotinsky. He was the founder of Begin's movement. But he was more than a mentor for Begin. He was almost a deity to Begin, who likened him to Moses and Leonardo da Vinci. Begin was only 15 when he first heard Jabotinsky speak, and worshiped him from then on. Jabotinsky came from Odessa, the most cosmopolitan Jewish community in Eastern Europe. And he was a towering intellect who spoke 6 languages. He was a prominent Russian novelist, poet, journalist, philosopher, and one of the most effective political organizers of the 20th century. One of his biographers seems to throw up his hands in disbelief. How could one person have the time and energy to achieve all this? Jabotinsky's skill as an orator was unsurpassed. He captivated Jewish audiences across the world. And the lower part of this screen shows him in New York City. Now, Begin would learn his own art of speaking by imitating his master's firebrand style, including his gesticulations. What was Jabotinsky's message? Well, it was threefold. First, a chilling prediction. They are going to kill us here in Europe, and we have to immigrate. He concluded this as early as 1903 in response to the wide-scale pogroms across Tsarist Russia, plundering, beating, raping, and the murder of over 100,000 Jews, often abetted by the authorities. You know, perhaps the greatest modern Hebrew poem came out of the infamous Kishinev pogrom, depicting not only the savagery of the attackers, but also the meekness of the Jewish victims. Jabotinsky, wanting to shake the Jews out of their passivity, brilliantly translated that poem into Russian, making it accessible to the Jewish masses. Here are just a couple of lines from In the City of Slaughter by Chaim Nachman Bialik. Concealed and cowering the sons of the Maccabees, it was the flight of mice they fled. The scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs. The pogroms did put in motion the emigration of about 2 million Jews to the United States. But Jabotinsky's second premise was that true Jewish freedom and security could only be attained in the biblical homeland, Eretz Yisrael. And third, the only way this can be accomplished is through force of arms. Let's look at the next slide. This is the emblem of the Irgun established in 1931, just around the same time that Jabotinsky began his movement of revisionist Zionism. Let's take a look. The top is just the abbreviation Irgun Tzvai Leumi. Often, for that reason, sometimes this is referred to as Etzel, but the first word Irgun is also usually used. Now, what do we see here in this map that's on their emblem? If you look at the left side of the map, you see a vertical line. That's the Jordan River. Now, even today, 90 years later, Israel, after winning several wars and expanding itself, only has territory to the left of that line, to the west of that line. The Jordan River is the boundary of Israel on the east side. What do you see in this map? You see that they are proposing not just what was Palestine, but much more than that. They have on their emblem everything that is today Israel plus Jordan, the kingdom of Jordan. That's what they're proposing. And you see the only way to the hand with the gun, that's the only way to take it. Now the bottom says rak kach. That means only thus. Now, Jabotinsky wrote a song, and the last line of each of the four stanzas was the following: two banks has the Jordan. One is ours, and the other one is ours. He said the Jordan River was not a border, but the spinal cord of the future Jewish state. Now, Begin would not drop this emblem, this map showing Jordan as well as Palestine. He wouldn't drop this map until 1965. So you see why I put territorial maximalism. Okay, you can remove that slide now. Thank you. Now, unsurprisingly, Jabotinsky was considered by many to be a fanatic. When the emblem was created, there were only 175,000 Jews in Palestine, not even 17% of the total population. Britain, the world's strongest colonial power, tightly controlled their mandate with tens of thousands of troops. Now, Jabotinsky was an atheist. He did not believe Eretz Yisrael was a gift from God. No, his foundation stone was national self-determination, that the Jewish claim to statehood was just as valid as other modern nationalisms. For example, the Irish, who also fought for independence against Britain and won in 1922. Of course, the Irish were already in place on their land. Palestine, by contrast, was overwhelmingly Arab. Jabotinsky predicted that, like the British, they too would have to be subdued. He thought aggressive struggle was inherent in human nature, that the world is a jungle, basically. And one of his most famous essays is entitled, "Man is Wolf to Man." Mainstream Zionism, he believed, was hopelessly naive, even cowardly, in not preparing for the bloody battles that inevitably lay ahead. Thus, he founded his own revisionist movement. Revisionist meaning not only to revise, but to literally to revision Zionism. And that chart you saw a little bit back, that shows you how fully this revisionism went. Now, because of his militancy, his extreme territorial goals, and the cult of personality surrounding him, Jabotinsky was often labeled a fascist. Ben-Gurion called him Vladimir Hitler. To be sure, Jabotinsky admired Mussolini, but the label of fascist is unfair. He believed in parliamentary democracy. He was not interested in being a dictator. Now we turn to Begin. Unlike the worldly Jabotinsky, he came from the small city of Brisk, Poland, grew up learning rabbinic texts in an Orthodox home, which decades later, as a politician, would help him draw traditional Jews to his side. He was also very comfortable in Polish society. He left his cloistered Jewish community to study law in Warsaw. Enthralled by Jabotinsky, the gifted youth rose in the revisionist ranks. By 1939, still in his mid-20s, he became the head of Beitar, that militant youth group. Jabotinsky died the following year, and Begin was considered his heir apparent. But in 1940, he fled Nazi-occupied Warsaw for the still neutral Lithuania. His parents and only brother, back in Brisk, would be murdered by the SS. And as the film vividly shows, he too became a victim, incarcerated in Vilna for 9 months by the Soviets for his Zionist activities, and then imprisoned in the Siberian Gulag, where he endured hunger, torture, and the vicious anti-Semitism of fellow prisoners. He would be scarred for life, both by losing his loved ones in the Shoah, he was a sole survivor, and his own harrowing ordeal at the hands of another totalitarian regime. It all confirmed for Begin Jabotinsky's view of the diaspora as malevolent, validated his mentor's response, militant Zionism. He was released because after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the Kremlin permitted Polish nationals, even prisoners, to join a Polish brigade fighting under the Allies. By an amazing stroke of luck, it was placed under British command and sent to the Middle East. Unlikely as it sounds, Begin reached Jerusalem in May 1942 as a Polish private, only 28, and with no other military experience. He soon took over command of the Irgun. Now, consider the excruciating dilemma facing the Zionist movement during World War II. The Jewish percentage of Palestine's population had doubled since 1930. Now it stood at 450,000, 1/3 of the total. But in 1939, the British issued their infamous white paper, refusing to consider statehood or raise their meager quota for Jewish immigrants. Yet, how could you rise up against them, given that they were embroiled in a life and death struggle against Nazi Germany? Could you make them divert men and arms to fight a Jewish uprising in Palestine? In short, could you impede their war effort? While the fate of European Jewry, the fate of the world hung in the balance. And remember, for the first 2 years of the war, Britain stood alone. This agonizing plight split the Yishuv. That's the term for the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv. Split it into 3 parts. The large majority, labor Zionists, urged restraint toward the British, havlaga in Hebrew. They encouraged illegal immigration to Palestine, but refrained from violent resistance. Rather, they pursued aggressive diplomatic efforts in Washington and London to get Britain to lift the white paper. This seemed in reach because Chaim Weizmann, the eminent British scientist and World Zionist Organization president, he was greatly admired by his country's policymakers. Now, the opposite path was chosen by a small band of extremists known as the Stern Gang, Lehi in Hebrew, which had broken off from the revisionist movement immediately after Jabotinsky's death in 1940. Even more radical than Begin, they believed the Jews to be a master race and were willing to suppress or expel the Arabs whom they saw as inferior. Obsessed with getting the British out of Palestine, They sought help from the Soviets, from fascist Italy, even from Nazi Germany. They were rebuffed by all three, but they tried. That one of Lehi's leaders, Yitzhak Shamir, would later become Israel's prime minister, is even more astounding than Begin's ultimate rise to power. Lehi resorted to terrorist tactics from their inception in 1940. They killed British servicemen and bureaucrats, assassinated Jews whom they suspected were informers. Now, how would Begin react in this darkest moment in Jewish history? He too decided to take up arms against the British, but not until it looked like they were winning the war. He felt that time had arrived in early 1944 and openly declared an armed revolt in Palestine. His Irgun, better equipped than Lehi, many of whose fighters had been killed or jailed by then, was larger than Lehi. Even so, Begin's forces numbered only a few hundred against a well-trained colonial army that was now 100,000. At first, he opted not to attack British soldiers, but rather to sabotage the inner workings of the occupation, blowing up courthouses, police stations, the hated immigration bureaus, income tax offices, and the like. To obtain more weapons and explosives, the Irgun extorted money from Jewish businesses and robbed banks. Begin was now a wanted man with a price on his head of 2,000 British pounds and had to move from one safe house to another, as the film shows, assuming multiple false identities, even that of an Orthodox rabbi. Now, Ben-Gurion was enraged by the actions of Lehi and the Irgun. The breaking point came in November 1944, when Lehi perpetrated its most shocking attack to date, assassinating Lord Moyne, the UK's High Commissioner for the Middle East and a close personal friend of Churchill. Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann were convinced that Britain was just on the verge of lifting the white paper, but the deadly deed made it more anti-Zionist than ever. Now the police intensified their search, both for Lehi and Irgun, for the leadership of both. Labor Zionism's militia, the Haganah, cooperated with the British in this dragnet known as the Saison, or hunting season. For half a year, the Haganah informed on Jewish underground fighters and sometimes caught them and turned them over to the authorities. Now, after the war ended, Britain stubbornly clung to its cruel policy of barring Jewish immigration. So Ben-Gurion changed direction and himself declared an armed revolt against the British, joining Lehi and the Irgun, which now went from being his enemies to being his allies. This united Hebrew resistance carried out 11 successful missions against the British, but the headstrong Begin went too far, and a spectacular attack he ordered in June 1946, and this is glossed over in the film in less than a minute. This went terribly wrong. Can we see the next slide, please? With Lehi, the Irgun planted 800 pounds of TNT in several large milk canisters in the basement of Jerusalem's King David Hotel, which housed the British military headquarters. The explosion far greater than expected, brought down half of an entire wing of the building, graphically depicted here, killing 91, including 17 Jewish civil servants and over 40 Arab workers. The documentary mentions the warning called in before the blast, but it was not early enough and not properly directed. Most historians believe that it went not to the British High Command to evacuate the building, but rather simply to a hotel switchboard operator who either ignored it or couldn't alert the authorities in time. The bombs went off on a Monday around noon. Not the best timing to limit casualties. It was a dramatic example of a major shortcoming throughout Begin's career, not carefully overseeing the details of an operation and being ill-served by subordinates. He was an inspirational leader, but sometimes not a diligent one. Okay, you can remove that slide. This action resulted in the breakup of the United Hebrew Resistance Movement, and Ben-Gurion and Begin would be bitter enemies from that time on. For many Holocaust survivors still in the DP camps, carnage on this scale made them think twice about Aliyah. Now let me turn to an incident the following year, 1947, not even mentioned in the film, which also illustrates the wide repercussions of Begin's tactics. The Irgun had stormed a British prison, freeing dozens of their men who had been held there. A great victory. But in the attack, 3 Irgun fighters were captured and sentenced to death. So Begin ordered the kidnapping of 2 British soldiers and announced that if his men were executed, he would respond in kind. The British hanged the 3 Irgun prisoners, and the same day, Begin ordered the hanging of the 2 British sergeants. But the Irgun wanted to kill not just 2 Britons, but 3 to avenge the death of their 3. So they booby-trapped one of the dead bodies. And when a British patrol came to cut down their slain comrades, the bomb went off. However, it only blew up one of the corpses. Now, let's take a look at the next slide, please. Here you see the hanging sergeants. Maybe such cold-blooded methods were called for when so much was on the line. It's very hard for me to judge this. One biographer entitled his chapter on the hanged sergeants, "A Rope for a Rope." What followed was a riot of British policemen and soldiers in Tel Aviv that killed 5 Jews, injured many more, and destroyed dozens of businesses. The reaction in the UK was also one of fury, and you see these newspaper headlines right below. London newspapers published photos of the hanged sergeants and played up the bomb rigged to a corpse as something particularly horrible. The Anglo-Jewish community strongly condemned the attacks, but this did not prevent assaults on Jews and synagogues throughout Britain. Okay, can remove that slide, thank you. Now, gruesome as this incident was, it had one very positive consequence, a tipping point in shifting London's Middle East policy. public opinion there was already turning against the occupation of Palestine. So costly in lives and money at a time when the UK was struggling with severe domestic problems, such as shortages of housing and food, which food still had to be rationed. So in 1947, the same year they withdrew from their largest colony, India, Britain gave its mandate to the new United Nations. Let's look at the next slide. In November 47, the UN came up with a partition plan, creating the first Jewish state in 2,000 years, as well as an Arab state. You see that in the map on the left. And you can also see that this is not ideal in any way. The Jewish state is in orange, and it is barely contiguous. The Arab state, the horizontal green lines, that's in 3 pieces and not even contiguous. One commentator referred to this map as 2 serpents in embrace. But Ben-Gurion immediately accepted this because it meant that after 2,000 years, a Jewish state was coming into existence. Begin adamantly rejected, saying that Eretz Israel is indivisible. The Palestinian Arabs immediately rose in revolt, and 5 surrounding Arab countries made it clear they would invade after the British departure set for May 15, 1948. Now, the map on the right shows how in the course of the Civil War and War of Independence, Israel was able to come into existence with better boundaries. They were able to take the Galilee in the north. They were able to take the entire Sinai. And they were able to take that vital strip between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. This is still not very defensible. There's only 40 miles between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but they were able at least to create something that was viable. Okay, you can remove that map now. Thank you. Essential in driving the British out was the 4-year-long insurgency of the Irgun and Lehi, whatever you think of their terror tactics. But such actions alone would not have brought about a Jewish state. Indispensable, too, were the kibbutzim and moshavim established by labor Zionism in strategic locations, as well as the unflagging diplomacy and illegal Jewish immigration that I mentioned earlier. So I think about it this way. Although the 2 main branches of the Zionist movement were bitter enemies, they each carried out their respective missions. They didn't realize it at the time, but they desperately needed one another. Now, the worst clashes of all, which brought Israel to the brink of a Jewish civil war, came in its most vulnerable period, the War of Independence. Having grown to 4,000 soldiers, the Irgun fought independently during the first phase of the war against the Palestinian Arabs. But sometimes it coordinated missions with the far larger Haganah, until about 5 weeks before the state was declared. On April 9th, 1948, about 100 Irgun and Lehi fighters attacked the Arab village of Deir Yassin, near Jerusalem. And what happened there remains hotly contested to this day, and highly politicized, I might add. But the large majority of scholars agree on a few things. A truck with a loudspeaker imploring the inhabitants to evacuate got stuck in a ditch and no warning was received. That's shades of the King David Hotel block. The villagers unexpectedly fought back with gunfire, and they killed 5 Irgunists. The resistance was quelled by the soldiers going house to house and throwing in grenades, which resulted in the death of about 110 civilians, mostly women and children. It's likely that some Arabs were shot while fleeing and others executed. Deir Yassin is referred to as a massacre by the Palestinian commentator in the film, and many reputable Jewish historians use that word as well. Under the ferocious pressure of war, many of the ill-trained Jewish attackers snapped and committed atrocities. Horrific as it actually was, the Arabs grossly exaggerated, claiming twice the number of victims and also alleging rape and mutilation for which there is no evidence. Needless to say, the Arabs committed crimes in this period that were just as heinous, if not more so. Several days later, in what may have been a reprisal for Deir Yassin, a convoy bringing medical supplies to the Hadassah hospital in Jerusalem was ambushed by Palestinians who killed 76 Jews, including dozens of doctors and nurses. Now, Deir Yassin, which contributed to the mass Arab flight from Palestine, became a terrible stain on the Irgun and Lehi. Although a Haganah commander had reluctantly approved the attack, the massacre can hardly be laid at their feet since no Haganah fighters were on the scene. For the rest of his life, Begin admitted that civilians were killed there, but only in the normal course of combat, he said. And he overstated the strategic value of Deir Yassin and greatly praised the military success of the operation. So, turning to the film, I disagree with Daniel Gordis that Begin always took responsibility for his actions. And I especially take issue with Gordis's claim that Ben-Gurion always ducked out, as he put it, and pinned the blame for his mistakes on others. Let's face it, these were both legendary leaders, but also pragmatic politicians, seeking to put themselves and their movements in the best light possible. And both had to be calculating to outmaneuver rivals within their movements, something else the film skirts. Upheaval gives you the impression that Begin had a moral compass that Ben-Gurion lacked. In fact, both had superhuman strengths. Both had glaring weaknesses. Tragically, their faults were most on display during the Altalena affair, 2 months after Deir Yassin, which nearly strangled the infant Jewish state in its cradle. After independence was declared, the Arab armies invaded. Irgun and Lehi were fighting under the command of Ben-Gurion's IDF, Israel Defense Forces, but as distinct brigades under the IDF. The crisis arose when a ship called the Altalena, the name was one of Jabotinsky's pen names, by the way, sailed from France to Israel. It was laden with thousands of modern weapons and millions of rounds of ammunition intended for the Irgun and Lehi. It also carried 1,000 volunteer fighters for those 2 brigades. Begin had not arranged for it, but now that it was en route, he naturally wanted to take advantage of this golden opportunity. It arrived during a brief UN-brokered truce So it anchored off a remote beach north of Haifa. Again, Israel is barely a month old at this point. And in the midst of this costliest war in its entire history, a war that could have gone either way, a war that Israel won by a whisker. Now, who was to get that precious cargo? Begin rushed to the beach and negotiated with one of Ben-Gurion's top deputies. They agreed that 20% of the weapons would go to the Irgun. But Begin insisted that every IDF soldier receiving one of the guns would be informed that it came from the Irgun ship. On this seemingly minor point, neither side gave in and the deal fell through. Meanwhile, dozens of Irgun soldiers deserted their IDF units and descended upon the beach. After a tense two-day standoff, they began unloading the weapons, and the IDF fired on them, killing 6 Irgunis and losing 2 of their own soldiers. So for the first time, a pitched battle between the two sides. Far worse was to come. Begin himself boarded the Altalena and ordered it to sail to Tel Aviv. He felt that if it were in full view of the public, there would be so much support for the Irgun that the IDF would have no choice but to let the shipment come ashore. This was on Begin's part a colossal misjudgment. Ben-Gurion was incensed at the prospect of a second army outside the IDF. Especially with Begin aboard the ship, he feared a full-scale insurrection could be the goal. Or at the very least, that the Irgun would wage war on its own beyond the UN partition boundaries, thus imperiling a future territorial settlement. The Irgun was already fighting on its own in Jerusalem. After the vessel came close to the Tel Aviv coastline, Begin refused to let representatives come on board to negotiate. Let's take the next slide, please. So Ben-Gurion's men fired shots toward the ship, warning shots they claimed, but a reckless decision, since the Altalena was filled with munitions and it was indeed hit. Fires and explosions followed and a gun battle ensued. The freighter broke apart and most of the weapons were never recovered. In the fighting, 16 Irgunis were killed and 55 wounded. It is not true, as the film states, that the Irgun did not return fire. They did, and 3 IDF soldiers were killed and many more wounded. Recall the Irgun had also killed 2 IDF soldiers on the beach near Haifa. I included a picture of Ben-Gurion here because I want you to see another great leader, and I think his face here reflects his determination. He was, as this says, not only prime minister, but defense minister as well. And he was the one really in command of the army that would win the War of Independence. Now, to his credit, Begin ultimately backed down after losing this terrible and probably avoidable confrontation. And both the Irgun and Lehi were fully absorbed into the IDF. Yet I hardly consider this episode heroic in any way. Begin would always claim that Ben-Gurion was trying to kill him personally on the Altalena, even pointing at the prime minister in public and shouting, "That man shot at me with a cannon." Ben-Gurion would always answer, "And God bless that cannon." Okay, you can remove that slide, thank you. Now, after peace came, Begin gradually made the transition from guerrilla warrior to political leader, although he was a fiery one. Let's look at the next slide. This is Begin in opposition, and the clenched fist was his trademark. By the way, this is some picture of Jabotinsky. It's like dominates the entire view here. Now, Begin founded the Herut, or Freedom Party, garnering 12% of the vote in the first Knesset election, but falling to only 7% in the second election. One incident in 1952 showed how incendiary he could be. Ben-Gurion struck an agreement with West Germany for reparations, about $1 billion in cash and goods, worth over 10 billion today, to fledgling Israel, including a fleet of merchant ships, steel works, much more. Begin's own profound loss in the Holocaust, his immense sacrifices during the struggle for statehood, and his marginalization in the new Israel all boiled over during the debate on the reparations deal in the Knesset. In nearby Zion Square, he harangued a crowd of about 10,000, declaring the deal with the German murderers, as he put it, the greatest abomination in Jewish history. Okay, you can remove that slide now. Now, one of the film's main omissions is that Begin incited a riot of many hundreds who marched with him to the Knesset, smashed its windows with rocks, burned nearby cars, had to be subdued with tear gas. Begin falsely shouted to the mob it was the same kind of gas used to exterminate the Jews in Auschwitz, inflaming them even more. Inside the chamber, he went up to the podium and rained down curses on Ben-Gurion before the session had to be closed because of the uproar outside. Begin was suspended from the parliament for 3 months. In an impassioned radio address that evening, Begin insisted he would fight to the death over this issue. But like the agreement like the Altalena incident, he backed down, and the agreement with Germany was approved, as you all know. Now, let me conclude with Begin turning to the electoral process after this. Now, one constituency in particular, as I noted before, was the Mizrahim, who had fled their countries after Israel was established and would soon approach a majority of the Jewish population. After making Aliyah, they often had to live in squalid transit camps. They were looked down upon as second-class citizens and called chakchachim in Hebrew slang, meaning riffraff. They resented the condescending Ashkenazi elite represented by the Labor Party. Begin, though, had an affinity for them. They were outside the establishment like himself. His reverence for traditional Judaism struck a chord in the hearts of many Mizrahim who felt someone was finally listening to their grievances. His European manner did not grate on him. Grate on them. They flocked to his rallies and excitedly chanted, "Begin, Begin." No other Israeli leader ever received such adulation. A big leap toward respectability came on the eve of the Six-Day War, when Begin was invited by Prime Minister Eshkol to be a cabinet member in the grand governing coalition to face this emergency, something Ben-Gurion would never have allowed. Begin soon joined with several smaller right-wing parties to form Likud, and in 1977, it won a large plurality, making him prime minister in a coalition with the religious parties. This was the political earthquake, the upheaval of the film's title. The lifelong rebel now stepped into the role of statesman leading the nation. The results, not least of all the policy of expanding Jewish settlements on the West Bank, the results are with us still. In his victory speech, Begin invoked Jabotinsky at length, but perhaps the words of another Zionist thinker crossed his mind, Theodor Herzl, who had also been feared as a dangerous demagogue and derided as a believer in fantasies. Herzl declared, "If you will it, it is not a dream." Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, so much, giving us a better understanding of so much of the film. The film will be available for several more days. So if you haven't yet seen it, please do. It's really, whatever your political opinion, I think it's a very well done documentary. And we have, of course, two speakers, Fred and Avi, on Thursday night to give a broader perspective. What I would hope everyone has questions, so go to the chat and type in. But someone made a comment that there is a controversy over the massacre at Deir Yassin, and there's a book called The Massacre That Never Was. Fred, he asked, have you read it? And what is your opinion on it, or other literature that says it wasn't, as you mentioned, as any massacre is bad, but it was overstated.
Right. I have not read that book, but I'm going on the basis of the most authoritative historians. I cannot do original research of this, but I look at works like the book 1948 by Benny Morris. He reads not only Hebrew, but also Arabic. He did prodigious research to put all this together. But many, many other scholars, many other historians say that this was indeed a massacre. It's not true that it never happened. I did say, and I would agree with anyone who says this, it was exaggerated by the Arabs. Remember I mentioned they claimed twice the number of victims. They claimed rape and mutilation, which never happened. That's true. But this was a case in which atrocities were committed by Lehi and Irgun. I think there's no question that that was the case. Sometimes it's said, well, there was great strategic value for Deir Yassin. But actually, if you look on the map, Deir Yassin was not on the key road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, So Begin, hailed this as some great military operation, but it wasn't. And I would say that book shows that he didn't take responsibility for this. It's really what I'm referring to is as I said before, the consensus of the most authoritative historians. Okay.
Okay, there's a lot of people say thank you. And there's also controversy now, but we won't go into it, about a place called Tentura. And Benny Morris has said that there wasn't a massacre, though there was some individual, not organized, atrocious things, but it was not an organized thing by the commanders. Yeah. Benny Morris he's an Israeli, he does huge amounts of research. And so I would love to have him, but his honorarium is a little bit more if we bring him from Israel. So that's not going to happen at the moment, especially when COVID's still around. But I do recommend reading his books. And there's an excellent, I don't know what you think of Anita Shapira, who is a historian in Israel. I think, who's very, I don't like the word balance, but I think can be trustworthy in regard to a lot of what she writes.
Yeah, I would also say, just look at if anyone is interested in this, just look at the best general histories of Zionism and the state of Israel, like Sacker's book, right? The history of Zionism in Israel, Abraham Sacker, or Walter LaCour's book, right, on the history of Zionism. Any of these just outstanding scholars, they wrote about the whole thing. Look at their pages on Deir Yassin, and you'll see what happened there. This is not something that can be swept under the rug. But let's even say these things happen in war, right? Fighters, snap and they do these things, right? It can happen. We Americans know something much, much worse happened in Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, right? Lieutenant Calley. That was of a much larger scale. Wouldn't compare Deir Yassin to that. But these things happen in war. Okay, one can say that. But to say it didn't happen, I think is really not recording history properly.
Someone writes that they saw a documentary about Begin and the war in Lebanon. I know Avi Shalom on Thursday night, and it'll begin at 7:30, not 7, because he's in Israel and he wants to have another half hour of sleep. But he's going to be talking about the war in Lebanon. But since you are here, the person writes that it really was Begin who knew everything, but that Ariel Sharon was blamed. Do you have any feeling towards that at all?
Yeah, I do. First of all, let me say, I was living in Israel during that war in Lebanon. I think it was the worst thing in all of Israeli history. Maybe you could say the assassination of Rabin, or even this Altalena incident I mentioned, but I would put the war in Lebanon really up there. It was a complete mistake, and it cost the lives of 1,000 Israeli soldiers. The controversy is this, that Begin approved, an invasion of Lebanon to clear out the PLO that would go about 40 miles into Lebanon. But General Sharon went all the way to Beirut, and then he tried to create a regime change by making the president the Christian phalangist, Bashir Gemayel, who was then assassinated. It was just a terrible thing. That's something that, in fact, I taught a course on this when I got back to Berkeley, and I entitled it Israel's Vietnam. It was just the whole thing was just a terrible mistake. Now, so the controversy is, did Begin know what Sharon was doing? Was Begin somehow hoodwinked by Sharon? I don't know, but I think this shows something about Begin, that he was sometimes ill-served by his subordinates. You see this in some of the incidents I mentioned from even before independence. So that's something that, in a way, he deserves some of the blame. If you're prime minister and you're planning an operation like this, if your general goes so far and goes to the capital of another country, and Israel even stood by while these phalangists, massacred Palestinians there at Sabra and Shatila. I think that's really shows a very big shortcoming. Now, I will say, again, the film covered that very thoroughly, I thought, and it was a tragedy. Begin could not recover from that emotionally or politically. And as you know, from that point on, he went into being a recluse, really. So it just, of course, his wife died around the same time. But I would say that, one would have to do original research to really know that interaction between Sharon and Begin at that time.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you, Fred.